Thank you very much. Good morning, Potomac family. I have to tell you that my body and my mind are not ready to transition from the pathway that we have been on in the last few moments. Thank you, Carl. That was incredibly rich. I've been asked to speak about understanding cultural dynamics when my way isn't the only way. I'll start by telling you I was born in Canada, in southern Alberta. I don't think anybody told me that, but I learned that southern Alberta is the center of the world. We do everything right there. I was educated in Alberta, except for a 2-year exile to the United States for seminary. I was employed in Alberta, and then one day a call came from the General Conference. Would you go to Pakistan? I didn't know where Pakistan was. I knew it was not next to Alberta. So in what I'm going to share with you this morning, you'll see, I suppose, a lot of my personal journey in appreciating and understanding cultural dynamics. The time meter is running, and so if you will listen fast, I will need to speak fast as we talk about what we want to accomplish, to understand the unseen elements of culture, to recognize my cultural biases, to know how to relate effectively with persons from other cultures, and to demonstrate cultural awareness and understanding in my work responsibilities. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, to value unity and diversity in the church. Seventh-day Adventist employees may be called upon to work in or with colleagues from cultural environments that differ markedly from their own. It's therefore increasingly important to understand how cultural sensitivity functions in the workplace environment and in the global family. We, many times, although we live in a very multicultural nation, there are many people that don't really experience cross-cultural shock until they travel internationally. I agree with the person who said there are no foreign lands. It is only the traveler who is foreign. So if we take a look at the world today, the world in a village of 100 people has about 60 Asians, 16 Africans, 10 Europeans, 9 Latin Americans, 5 North Americans. If you break that Asian category down into smaller blocks, Chinese, Indians are predominant, then there's many others grouped together. If we look at the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1960, it had a demographic distribution something like this. Africa 20, Asia 13, Europe 16, North America 27, Latin America 20, Oceania 4. If you look at the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 2017, it looks like this. Africa 41, Asia 18, Europe 2, North America 6, Latin America 30, Oceania 2, and Middle East 0. I'm sorry for those of you who are sitting at the other end of the room. You may need to use your binoculars to see some of these figures. If you look, I beg your pardon. Working on the wrong one here. This is a look at the church in 1960 and a look at the church in 2017. You will notice there's been a dramatic increase in church membership elsewhere in the world. We live in a multicultural world. The extent and impact of communication technology results in very few people living in a monocultural setting. However, a person's culture of origin can have long-lasting influence on behavior, even in a multicultural environment. Now, we can slice demographics almost infinitely and get smaller and smaller cultural groups, but those who study and comment on global cultures tend to identify 10 culture clusters in the world: the Nordic, the Anglo, Germanic, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Confucian Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Arab world. We'll think about not all of these, but some of them more particularly as we move on. Cultural differences may not always be complex and confusing, but the possibility for misunderstanding is greater due to unfamiliarity with individuals and the beliefs and attitudes that motivate their behaviors. A study of cultures necessarily involves making generalized statements, summaries of likelihood rather than certainty. Generalizations can be helpful in moving us toward understanding, but should never be taken as absolutes. So we begin with the question, what is culture? It's the sum of shared assumptions, values, and beliefs held by a large group of people that results in characteristic behaviors. Notice the invisible parts: assumptions, values, and beliefs. The invisible parts. Notice the visible parts: behaviors. Behaviors. That which we see and so often make judgments upon without understanding the invisible parts. I think the person who said, "You cannot simultaneously cherish people's cultures while discarding their beliefs," was quite correct. So, what may be the underlying belief? Now it's time for audience participation. What may be the underlying belief to these behaviors? Inviting the janitor to eat with you, the janitor not being your spouse. What's an underlying belief that may contribute to that behavior? A sense of equality. Okay? Asking the boss's opinion when you are the expert. Trying to get a raise. Deference to authority. What about disagreeing openly at a meeting? Being direct. Okay? Accepting without question that something cannot be changed. Fatalism. And we're going here. Agreeing in a meeting to a suggestion you think is wrong. Saving face. Culture-based behavior is not accidental or arbitrary. It has a foundation. There's a cause and effect relationship that operates in culture. Now, ethnocentrism is studying the world through the lens of my own culture, evaluating other people by my cultural values, beliefs, and behaviors. And I told you a few moments ago, I was very ethnocentric. Southern Alberta was the center of the world. We did everything right. Anybody who did something different just hadn't learned enough and needed to grow up to be normal like us. Now, much of our behavior has no inherent meaning. Over the course of time, a culture decides or comes to accept what a specific behavior means. When people assign similar meaning to a specific behavior, communication can take place either with the use of language, sounds with agreed upon meaning, or gestures. I'll give you some examples. What does this mean? In North American culture, used to be very acceptable, okay. In some cultures in the world, very offensive. You never want to use that gesture. Beckoning with the finger. In some cultures, this is extremely rude to point to a person. A finger can be used to point to an inanimate object, but not someone who's alive. If you want to point to a person, you use the whole hand. You see? Cultures have adopted certain behaviors and invested those behaviors with meaning. We see the behaviors and we don't always understand the meaning. What does it mean? Okay, blah, blah, blah. What does this mean? Yes or no? That's what I thought. No. In certain parts of the world, this means yes. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. In some parts of the world, you never sit in a room with your legs crossed and the sole of your shoe pointing to a person next to you. Incredibly insulting. We don't understand the beliefs that lie behind behavior. In cross-cultural situations, an important principle to remember is to suspend judgment or the assignment of meaning to behavior until you can discover what the behavior means. Now, not all behavior is cultural. Cultural behavior occupies a space between universal and personal behavior. So here's some audience participation once again. Is it universal, cultural, or personal? Sleeping with an open bedroom window? Personal. Running from a wild animal? Universal. Okay. Men opening doors for women? Cultural. Eating regularly? Universal. Speaking Spanish? I heard someone say universal. I expected that. Yeah. I've heard it before. Feeling regret at causing an accident? Universal. Wearing a suit and tie to worship? Who said universal? Dislike of wearing a suit and tie to worship? Yeah. Okay. All right. Needing sleep? Needing sleep now? Yeah, okay, I got you. Some cultural differences are just that, differences. We should not assign a value judgment, right or wrong, to them. It may be appropriate to assess a value judgment on some cultural behavior, but we must not rush to judgment as soon as we notice a difference. Our tendency is to see cultural behaviors as right or wrong. In the USA, people drive on the right side of the road. In England, they drive on the wrong side of the road. Okay? We tend to look at things. But culture involves difference. And we can't always divide things sharply between right and wrong. Difference occurs between the right and wrong. I think this statement from Augustine has a lot to teach us. We stand in awe of the ocean, the thunderstorm, the sunset, the mountains. But we pass by a human being without notice, even though the person is God's most magnificent creation. So let's take a look at the building blocks of culture. Those who study and comment on global ideas about culture say there are 6 basic ingredients to culture. The concept of the cosmos, the concept of self, the concept of responsibility, of time, authority and control, and of communication. Let's take a look at the concept of the cosmos. That's the world view of religion. Some of the elements in that are theism, monotheism, polytheism, atheism. If you want to go as a Christian evangelist and talk to a Hindu, you need to understand something about the Hindu view of the cosmos. The character of God or the gods, loving or angry, origins, creation or naturalism, meaning and purpose in life, good and evil, the influence of spirits, death and the future. Is the future a restored earth, heavenly bliss, floating on clouds, playing a harp, reincarnation, or nothingness. These are cultural concepts that lie within the understanding of the cosmos. Now, particularly in the West, there is a tendency for culture to move away from Christianity, from any religious expression for that matter. Religion is increasingly consigned to the arena of private life with little or no opportunity for a voice in the public square. This situation is not true in several other cultural clusters around the world. In fact, in some areas of the world, religion is playing an increasing role in public life. So a question comes, how should we view the global church in a world of many cultures and differing worldviews that inform various aspects of those cultures? Is Seventh-day Adventism cross-cultural, countercultural, transcultural, or a subculture within cultures? Thank you. Thank you. All of the above. We come next to the concept of self. I'm sorry I have to go so quickly. I can't share some stories. We'll share a few, but we have to limit this. In the concept of self, there's a spectrum here between the individualist and the collectivist. Now, the individualist is that culture where the smallest unit of survival is the individual. The needs of the individual are satisfied before those of the group. Independence and self-reliance are stressed and greatly valued. Personal freedom is highly desired. There's more psychological and emotional distance from others. At the other end of the cultural spectrum in this concept of self is the collectivist. A group, usually the family, is the smallest unit of survival. One's identity is largely determined by his membership and role in a group. By considering the needs and feelings of others, one protects oneself. Harmony and interdependence are valued. Group decisions are more important than individual decisions. Now, we need to understand that no culture is exclusively at one end of this spectrum or the other. All cultures will exhibit some blend of the two concepts. However, cultures do tend more towards one or the other end of the spectrum. So here are some questions. Is it individualist or collectivist? Companies give Employee of the Year awards. Individualist. Harmony and saving face are highly valued. Friendships are many and casual. There's less of a need for signed contracts in business. A mother asks her 4-year-old what he or she wants to wear today. Individualist. Self-help books are popular. Individualist. Consensus decision-making is the norm. Collectivist. Now, a certain team of researchers looking at these 6 basic building blocks of culture decided to ask groups of 100 people in various culture clusters to plot on a line where they saw their own culture between the individualist and the collectivist. And out of the 10 or so groups, this is what was the result from that search. Groups of 100 people from each culture. Now, those of you who cannot read the display, starting at the left with the individualist culture, the USA, moving on to England, Germany, France, Russia, India, Japan, Mexico, Africa, Middle East, and the most collectivist culture, China. I happened to show this in another setting. It was really quite a monocultural setting outside of the United States. And as soon as people saw this and saw, the way cultures had identified themselves, several people began to snicker. And I listened, someone said, that is wrong. And I said, well, what's wrong with it? And they said, what is wrong is the USA part. You need to move the USA to the left about 3 meters. Now, isn't it Shakespeare who said, oh, would some power the gift he gives to see ourselves as others see us? Yeah. We move on, having to go quickly, to the concept of responsibility. And here, the spectrum is between universalism and particularism. Universalism is the idea that right is right regardless of circumstances. The same rules apply to everyone. Fairness, everyone alike in similar situations. There's no preferential treatment for family. Matters are to be analyzed and judged objectively, and you deal with the facts. Now, in the particularist culture, what is right in one situation may not be right in another. You have to evaluate circumstances. You treat family and friends the best you can. To be fair is to treat everyone as unique. Exceptions will be made for some. Personal feelings should not be ignored. Special requests can be made of in-group members because they are assured special treatment when the time comes. Now again, no culture is purely universalist or particularist. We say this about every one of these 6 blocks. So, audience participation, once again, is it universalist or particularist? An agreement is valid whatever happens afterward. Universalist. Friends stick together no matter what. Particularist. Objective reasoning takes precedence over subjective feelings. Justice is blind and impartial. Every situation is different. You cannot apply rules rigidly. If circumstances change, a promise may not need to be kept. Okay. Again, the same researchers with the 100, the groups of 100 people from the various cultures. Reading from left to right, if you cannot see the details on the screen, which I suspect is true for most here. From universalist to particularist. USA, farthest to the left. Germany, England, Japan, France, Russia, India, Mexico, Africa, China, Middle East. Okay, is there a pattern developing here? We come to the concept of time. What happened? Oh, okay, we're good. The concept of time. And here, the flow is from monochronic time to polychronic time. Now, we all know, regardless of what culture we're a part of, we know that time goes by. That's true in all cultures. Danish punctuality, says Max Messner, would result in hypertension in Greece. I think we understand what he's saying there. So the concept of monochronic time is that time is measurable and quantifiable, a limited amount of it. I'm watching my watch very carefully here. Efficiency and urgency are highly valued. The needs of people must be adjusted to the time, the schedule, the deadlines, etc. Interruptions are annoying because they waste time. Doing one thing at a time is better than trying to multitask. Polychronic time is elastic and limitless. There's always more time. The event is more important than the time. Schedules and deadlines can be changed since time must be adjusted to people's needs. It's not necessary to finish one thing before starting another. I told you we were invited to go from Alberta, where we live in monochronic time, to Pakistan. The Christmas season rolled around. And the people of the church on the compound came to me because we were the newest family on the compound. Would you speak for the Christmas morning service? Christmas fell on Wednesday that year. Would you speak for the Christmas morning service at the church at 10 o'clock in the morning? In Alberta, we do not have Christmas morning services. Okay. So on Christmas morning, I arrived at the church at 9:45. The door was still locked. At 9:50, the janitor came and unlocked the door. At 9:55, my wife and our 2 children came. And a moment or two after that, the janitor's wife came. At 10:00, there were 6 of us in the church. At 10:10, there were 8 of us in the church because the janitor's 2 children came. And this was 10 minutes after start time. 10:00 comes 60 seconds after 9:59. So my wife sat down at the organ and we sang 2 Christmas carols. And I gave a short devotional, and at 10:35 we were finished. And we walked out of the church. To our surprise, coming from all directions, along the paths and the roads, people dressed in their festive best, men in suits and ties, ladies in marvelous, Pakistani saris. They're absolutely beautiful. They were on their way to the Christmas morning service. It is 22:11. And at 11:00, the church is full. And we started again. Now, no culture is purely monochronic or polychronic. But the researchers who looked at these, who asked these groups of 100 people to plot on the list where they are, reading from the left to the right, left is monochronic, right is polychronic. USA, England, Germany, Japan, Russia, France, China, India, Africa, Middle East, and Mexico, all clustered there on the polychronic. I had gone from monochronic to polychronic. That is an adjustment. And I discovered I now know why the Lord tarries his coming. They will not be ready if he came on time. The next is the concept of authority and control. Here it moves from internal to external. Which statement do you agree with most? This was a question asked on a research paper. What happens to me is my own doing. Or sometimes I feel I don't have control in my life's direction. The researchers discovered that the percentage of Americans choosing the first statement was 89% of the group. Percentage of Chinese choosing the first statement, 35%. Now sometimes these are not coordinated, it seems. In the internal concept of authority, control over life is largely internal. Very few things have to be accepted as they are or cannot be changed at all. You can accomplish most anything you want to do. Listen to a graduation address at any school in North America. Okay? You can accomplish most anything you want to do. There are some places in the world where that is a foolish message. It works here. Success is up to you. You're responsible for what happens to you. Where there is a sense of external control and authority, control over life is largely outside the individual. Some things in life are simply predetermined. There are limits beyond which one cannot go. Success is then a combination of good fortune and your effort. Now, once again, no culture is purely internal or external, so we come to that line where cultures identified themselves. And reading from the left to the right, with the left being the internal, the right being external. USA, is there a pattern here that you notice? USA, Germany, England, Japan, France, Russia, China, India, Mexico, Middle East, and Africa. Notice how far they have placed themselves towards the external authority and control. These differences may be described as time-oriented bias versus a relationship-oriented bias. Does one or the other bias influence a person's valuation of the great commandment, love God and love your neighbor, above or beneath the Great Commission, go and make disciples? Is it realistic to think that one culture may emphasize the commission, time-oriented, while another may emphasize the commandment, relation-oriented? We come to the sixth. My clock is going just too fast here. Listen, I'm thank you very much. I am monochronic. The concept of communication. It's the concept of communication on which cultures differ the most, and the one affecting more aspects of the communication dynamics is the matter of directness. Now, in directness, it's seen more often in individualistic cultures. People lead more independent lives. There's less instinctive understanding of others. There's a tendency to be more explicit in speech, to say exactly what is meant rather than to suggest or imply. The words said are important. What is left unsaid is rather inconsequential. No can be said directly. Now, in cultures that have an indirect value of communication, it's more typical of collectivist cultures. They prefer inference, suggestion, or implication rather than direct speech. Harmony and saving face are important. Confrontation is avoided. Emphasis on relationships brings intuitive understanding and thus less need for specificity and directness. Be very careful how no is said. You know, there's a pastor in this group from Southern Asia. So that pastor will understand my confession. I was the secretary of the Southern Asia Division for a period of time before we left India. One Friday morning, just before closing time at noon, a colleague in the division office came into my office and closed the door. Came and sat down in the chair that was the other side of my desk. And he said, "Pastor, I need you to do something for me." I said, "Well, what can I do for you?" He said, "Pastor Cooper, I need a salary increase." Now, I am not the treasurer. I'm the secretary of the division. And I said, "Well, brother, why do you feel you need a salary increase?" He said, "Pastor, a person who is junior to me received a promotion at the union, and he is now getting 3% more than I'm getting." Do you see the cultural dynamics there? You know, I'm dense. I am very dense. And I said, "Well, brother, what is your job title?" I knew what it was. I just wanted him to tell me, because I pulled out the wage scale booklet. And I said, "Yes, the wage scale range for that job is from this percent to that percent. What percentage are you now receiving in remuneration?" He said, "I'm at the maximum, but I need more." I said, "Brother, no, I cannot do that for you. I saw his face darken. He looked at me and he said, Pastor Cooper, you have eaten food in my house. And he got up and left the office. And I wondered, what's going on? That food was months ago. I'm not the treasurer. I can't do what he's asking. Nobody can do what he's asking. He's wanting a promotion. I can't do it. I had to go and apologize to that man when I began to understand that in some cultures, not in Alberta, in some cultures, you must not say no directly. It's an insult to the person. It's an insult to the self-image. What I should have said, and I learned later, much to my embarrassment, I should have said, it's difficult. That means no. But it doesn't hurt. The concept of communication. I'm walking along the path on the way to the office one morning, and there is a broken window. And two kids from the compound are playing catch with the ball. I look at the window. Who did that? Oh, Pastor, we were playing catch, and it happened that the window broke. I want to know who did it. Sir, it happened. If you understand the culture, it happened means it was an accident. If one of those boys said, I did it, it means I meant to break the window. See? Cultural communication has so many very fine nuances. And the best thing when you encounter a new culture is to keep quiet until you can understand how people communicate. There are other factors in cross-cultural communication that are so important. Body language, space, power distance. So how did these groups of 100 people from these different cultural groups find themselves on the spectrum of communication? Here's what they discovered. I need to tell you, I should have told you earlier, that in my DNA chain, part of it is from Germany. Part of it, the other part, is a mixture of England and Ireland. And my gene expression is not the best of that combination of things. So when you see this matter of communication from the direct to the indirect, this is the way the culture groups saw themselves, the Germans being the most direct. That's the only place where some other cultural group replaced the USA from being the closest to that side of the spectrum. So it was Germany, USA, France, Russia, England, India, Mexico, Middle East, Africa, China, the most extreme indirect, Japan. Have you been to Japan? I tell you that, yeah. A wonderful place and wonderful people. It's good to learn some things about Japanese culture. before you make the kinds of mistakes that I am famous for. Okay. We need to talk a little bit about, our time is going by so fast here, the Bible and culture. In the move from the Old Testament covenant people to the New Testament covenant people, there's a shift from a single nation, the children of Israel, to an international group, the church, with representatives from all nations. The people of God come from every nation, tribe, tongue, and people. I tell you, the most dramatic piece of scripture that looks at cultural diversity is from Revelation. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, tongues, and people, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. That is the picture of diversity and unity. The Old Testament, New Testament transition to awareness of an international covenant people introduced many new and complex questions concerning the life of faith. How does one relate to government? How do believers relate to socially expected customs when those customs had religious overtones? What should be the religious posture with respect to economic structures in society? And how does a believer deal with persecution? Some insights from a study of culture. Every culture reveals something of God's image and likeness in humanity, while also giving evidence of how this image and likeness has been distorted and corroded by rebellion. Number 2, the mission of God addresses all of human existence and thus is cultural, cross-cultural, and transcultural. The gospel confronts all cultures for redemptive rather than destructive purposes. Number 3, the Bible encourages good citizenship while insisting that the worshipers of God have a primary allegiance to the King of Kings. Christians are to submit to the authority of the state, except in those situations where doing so places one in disobedience to God, the supreme authority. Can you imagine now the areas of the world where we have brothers and sisters who do not live under a democratic system? The kingdom of God is not to be equated with any political, social, or economic order, or with any culture for that matter. If differences are culturally based and not a violation of the clear teaching of Scripture, we can and should learn how to accept, honor, and respect fellow believers whose behavior may differ from ours on the basis of cultural background. The gospel message is meant for the whole world and every culture. In its mission to reach every culture, the church will need to engage increasingly with questions of unity and diversity. Relevancy to cultural and geographic specifics will lead to increasing diversity of practice, but this need not threaten the underlying unity of a mission-driven church. So, I want to close with a few reflections now on a world church. And what does it mean in practice? I'm sorry to introduce a controversial thing, but I want to quote part of an action from a general conference session. Not the part that you are thinking of, but the whole part. Further, in view of the widespread lack of support for the ordination of women to the gospel ministry in the world church, and in view of the possible risk of disunity, dissension, and diversion from the mission of the church, we do not approve ordination of women to the gospel ministry. The 55th General Conference session in 1990. Most of the time, when we refer to the 1990 General Conference session, we fail to mention that it was because of the risk of disunity. We cite the decision, but not the reason for the decision. Now, I want to think with you about diversity. It's a term used frequently in reference to race, gender, color, food, physical characteristics, age, behavior, size, talents, skills, traditions, viewpoints, culture, beliefs, including theological beliefs and political affiliations. Diversity means difference, but more than just difference. A circle and a square represent difference but not diversity. It is only when a circle and a square are collectively classified as shapes do they represent diversity. Our definition of diversity, the condition of having or being composed of differing elements, the inclusion, what happened? I'm sorry. The inclusion of different types of people in a group or organization. It occurs within a concept of things belonging to a group or a collection. The definition of unity, oneness or sameness. The quality or state of not being multiple. The combination or arrangement of parts so as to constitute a whole or to result in a singleness of effect. We must not be satisfied to think of unity only as sameness, nor should we think of diversity only as difference. Diversity exists only within a larger frame of reference that constitutes a unity of some kind, an identity or a larger purpose. Similarly, unity is much more than sameness. It is also that harmonization of difference, or the mutual contribution of different parts to a singleness of effect or identity. Diversity in and of itself is not wrong or undesirable. Diversity is seen in creation and in the development of civilization. Because the gospel is universal, its presentation and communication must be contextualized to the cultures it encounters. John's description of Christ as the Word is viewed as an accommodation to the Greek concept of logos in Stoic philosophy. Paul's use of, in him we live and move and have our being, was an ingenious link to ideas expressed by the Greek poets. Number 3, because the church is universal, it must become increasingly diverse as it expands and embraces new cultures. Cultural diversity cannot and must not be avoided by a church if that church is going to be faithful to the true nature of the church. Number 4, the church is God's agency for the demonstration of redeemed diversities that result in a restored and renewed unity. The Bible message recognizes many cultures. The gospel does not destroy culture. It redeems and beautifies culture. The gospel challenges all culture. A follower of Jesus lives within his or her culture, but also transculturally, outside his culture, because of the ethical and moral values of the gospel. The Seventh-day Adventist Church will exhibit cultural diversity because the claims of the gospel must be lived in each person's local situation. Number 7, we must not use culture as a way of imposing our values on others, nor should we insist on the right to practice cultural behavior in a way that offends others. The Pauline writings are so rich in this area. We haven't got time to comment. Appeals for unity that overlook the rightful place of biblically informed diversity will lead to further disunity. The basis for unity among God's people is their worship of God. No human organization, rules, or procedures can create the kind of oneness that comes from the worship of God. Christ's love for us and our love for Christ and his people creates a unity that embraces diversity. Thank you.
Wow. It's going to take a while to digest all that, isn't it? Awesome stuff. There's been a request to say, can we get some of this material? I know it's going to be on both the audio and the video online. and we will talk with Brother Cooper to see if we can get perhaps copies of the PowerPoint. Steve, if you could come join me, we just want to do a couple of housekeeping issues. Whatever our preferences, the conference is running on monochromic time, so we better talk about it a little bit. And that is that we do have a 15-minute break until 10:45. And so we encourage you to take advantage of that break. One of the ways you can take advantage of that break is stopping by some of the booths, and Steve has just a word on one of the stops you can make.
This is specifically for the pastors that are here. We are here as pastors and educators, and we do obviously have a joint ministry. Down out at our table, we just have different material that kind of explains what's happening with education within our conference. So we would like to invite you to come on over and visit the table and get to know each other. It is a common goal. Also, just to let you know, pastors, in our first breakout session for the educators down in the Lincoln Room, which is directly below, Dr. Tim Gillespie is going to be talking with us about how both of our ministries can complement each other. We want to support you in your ministry. We know that you want to support us in ours, and we thank you for that.
Not only do we have multicultures, we also have multi-opinions on what the room temperature ought to be. Please know that the room temperature has been adjusted up 5 degrees, and it will continue to be adjusted either up or down as circumstances may indicate. Also during the break, if you have not had a photo taken, or if you'd like a redo of your photo, that's me and I'm in that category, visit Tiffany out here to the turn right, then left, and there's a photo booth at the end of the hallway. She'll be happy to take a new picture of you. Lastly, we will be reconvening at 10:45, and the teachers will be meeting in the Lincoln Foreign Room, which is right beneath us on the first floor. Pastors will be back here. Thank you for your time and attention. We will see you in 15 minutes. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Thank you very much. I deeply appreciated the invitation from the conference president to spend a few moments about things I've learned. And I have really wondered, what are those things? You know, it's possible for a person to have some 50 years of experience, but 50 years of 1 year experience being repeated and repeated and repeated. I was invited at the end of college to become an intern in the Alberta Conference, my home conference in Canada. And the president said that they would sponsor me to the seminary at Andrews. I was delighted for that. Went to Andrews and left Andrews with a degree and traveled back to Alberta. The conference had assigned me and my wife to the district that was farthest from the conference office. You have to understand that in Canada, 90% of the population lives within 100 miles of the U.S. border. Okay? Now, there's a lot of Canada beyond that. And so I was assigned to northern Alberta. 4 churches, 2 church schools. They were not large churches. Farming communities. My wife and I drove from Andrews University on a kind of a 3-segment trip to what everybody else called northern Alberta. It was basically the northern part of central Alberta. There's a lot of northern Alberta beyond that. But it was the northernmost district in the Alberta Conference. We arrived there late at night. The church pastor's manse was a mobile home, a single-wide mobile home. We arrived there around midnight, parked our car. We had a little utility trailer behind it. We went in, tried to get some sleep. At 7 o'clock in the morning, now this is a farming community, and people are up with the sun. At 7 o'clock in the morning, there was a loud rap on the door, and we were still in bed. I hastily put on some clothes and went to the door, and here was a very large individual in farming clothes. He thrust out his hand and he said, "Good morning, my name is," and gave his name. And he said, "Are you the new pastor of the church?" And I said, "My name is Lowell Cooper. Yes, I've come to pastor here." He said, "We don't need a pastor here. But you are welcome. And we will teach you how to be a pastor." You know, at that moment, if I hadn't been so tired, I think I would have gotten in the car and driven somewhere else. Maybe applied for a job driving taxi or something. I was absolutely shocked. But he was kind. Sort of. And I thought, what on earth have I gotten into? I can't believe this. He was the head elder of one of 4 churches. And he said, "You're welcome. And we'll teach you about pastoring." So, okay, we had a little visit. And I realized he wasn't as gruff as what those opening comments were, but they just had me terrified. I'm a coward. He said, we'll teach you how to be a pastor. So for the next 4 years, we lived in that district of 4 churches. Interestingly, Dan Jackson, the president of the North American Division, came as an associate pastor in that district a couple of years later. He and I had the privilege of working together. We learned some very, very painful lessons from the same wonderful church members in a couple of those churches. Yeah. They kept their word. It was a lovely experience when we got to know them. They were very accepting. They were very forgiving. Very forgiving of mistakes that young pastors can make. And when we left, 4 years later, the conference asked me to take up departmental responsibilities at the Alberta Conference. It was really with a great deal of sadness. We left 4 congregations that we had learned to love and that had demonstrated their love for us. But that opening moment stayed with me. We don't need a pastor here. But you are welcome. I learned later that when you say a sentence with the word "but," the part of the sentence that comes after the "but" is more important than what goes before. I didn't understand it at that moment, but I came to appreciate it later because this dear elder and his lovely wife became our defenders when we really needed help. So I look back at those early days in my ministry as some of the most precious, because I had to learn in those years all of the lessons that I hadn't learned at the seminary, and indeed which I am afraid the seminary cannot teach. There are some things that can only be learned by absorbing them and by trial and error. And sometimes it's the trial of the members because of the errors of the pastor. And I did those. So I come to this session with you today to say that my experience in pastoral work was a long time ago. The conference evangelist came to an evangelistic meeting that I was conducting in that church, and he said to me, after the night's meeting, "You will never be an evangelist. You better think of something else." That was... Canadians can speak kind of directly, you know. They're not culturally attuned at times. Directness of speech is very common. So he said, "Yeah, you'll never be an evangelist. Better think of something else." I didn't know what else to think. It was very discouraging. But I've carried that legacy in my mind ever since. I don't know why. I can't seem to get rid of that thing. But I went from there 4 years in pastoral ministry amongst these churches. These were immigrant communities that settled the northern part of Alberta from Germany and the Ukraine predominantly, and so forth. Absolutely marvelous people. Went from there to work at the conference office in Calgary as a departmental director, and over the course of the next 4 years had, at one time, all the time, at least 3 departments, but over the 4 years covered 4 departments: lay activities and Sabbath school ministries and health and communication, whatever. Anyway, and then one day we got the invitation through a phone call, would we go to Pakistan? I had no idea what Pakistan was. We thought about it for a few moments and said, well, you know, if the church is calling us, then we sense that we accept that as God's voice, and we went to Pakistan to work at the union in departmental roles, and from there to the division office in India. From departmental functions there to the administrative functions and secretariat, and then to the general conference, first of all to secretariat, and then to the role of vice president. So I tell you this because what I have to say in these few moments may not touch where you're hurting, because the bulk of my experience has been in international service, in the global life of the church and the institutional life of the church. For the 16, 18 years at the General Conference, most of my work was involving travel to divisions around the world. I had very little to do with the departments at the General Conference. I was asked to serve as chair for General Conference institutions, Pacific Press, Loma Linda University and Loma Linda University Health for 16 years, ADRA, and so forth. So much of my work has been at the organizational and policy development level of church life. So what I'm going to say for a few moments this morning may be on things that don't necessarily touch life where you're at. And that's why we'll have an opportunity for discussion a little bit later. The president asked me if I would speak for a little while to the pastoral leadership of this conference about the things that I've learned. I have chosen instead to talk with you about things I am still learning. As I think you also have discovered that the things you've learned keep taking on fresh dimensions and fresh cues, and you always have to go back and do some revisionist learning. And that learning never stops. So I'd like to think with you about 4 or 5 things and then have opportunity for discussion, because I am a learner also, and I would value the opportunity of learning from you. The first thing that I'd like to suggest is that trust is the most important human resource. There is nothing more important and more valuable in the life of our global church than trust. Interorganizational trust, interpersonal trust. I think it's Stephen M.R. Covey that wrote the book, The Speed of Trust. Very, very good insight. He says that high trust produces speed, and low trust slows everything. And if you live in organizational life, you discover how true that is. Trust makes all the difference. And the first task, I think, of leaders is to be trustworthy. To be trustworthy. Technique and technology are important. But adding trust is the issue of the decade. Trying to get things coordinated here between my computer and my hand clicker. Let's see if we can do that. Trust is a function of both character, which includes integrity, and competence. Trust, combination of character and competence. I have a brother who is a marvelous mechanic, auto mechanic, heavy equipment mechanic. He was the foreman of the largest county in Alberta for its civic construction work. Just a masterful fellow. He has good character, but I would not trust him to work on my teeth. Okay? Because trust is a function not only of character, but of competence. And his area of competence is not dealing with teeth. It's dealing with dirt and equipment and stuff that's worth millions of dollars and so forth. So trust is a function of both character and competence. It is easy for us to focus on developing competence and to forget the character issues that are so important in the life of leadership. Covey says the quickest way to decrease trust is to violate the behavior of character. And the quickest way to build trust is to demonstrate a behavior of competence. Now, I say this because we are a global organization. And today, because of the speed of communication, what happens in one small part of our globe can easily be transported around the globe instantly. So the urgency in the life of leadership, no matter what the position, the urgency in the life of leadership is to seek to build trust. There are two kinds of trust. Personal trust. It's trust that employees and church members have in individual leaders. Am I a trustworthy person? Can people trust me? Is my word reliable? When I say I will keep a confidence, can people trust me that I will keep a confidence? That's what we mean by the first kind of trust. What kind of person is the leader? The second is organizational trust. It's trust that an organization's purposes are valid and that its policies will be fairly administered and implemented as stated. Organizational trust. Can people trust the church? That's a challenge for all of us who are in leadership. We all help to create the perception of organizational trust. I can trust this church. I may be able to trust an individual leader, but we need to have a cadre of employees, we need to have our membership being able to trust the church. I'm ashamed to say that there are some areas in our world church where trust, organizational trust, is not very strong. Not very strong. An area of the world in which I worked. Some of the leaders had difficulty following policies and ended up with organizations being taken to court. You know, and we go to the outside jurisdictions to deliberate on our internal conflicts. And I think of a case where for 7 years, an issue has been in the courts, which could easily be resolved if leaders paid attention to governance documents. And if leaders could just let go of pride and recognize that a mistake has been made. So how do I build trust as a person? How do I build trust as a leader? I think there are several ways. Doing the right thing because it's right. It's not always as easy as it sounds. Not exploiting the weakness of another. Admitting errors and weaknesses. By making principle-based decisions in moments of crisis. Setting reasonable objectives and goals. I think back, in some of my learning years about this, where it's easy to try and impress the people up there, by having just the most unreasonable goals. These are faith goals, These are, we know the jargon to defend all of this. but beneath it was my desire to impress somebody above me. That doesn't build trust. Setting reasonable objectives and goals, compliance with organizational policies, extending trust to others, and knowing when and how to maintain confidentiality. I guess I would say, brothers and sisters, that when I look back on my own ministry and attempts at leadership, effectiveness really comes down to whether or not a person can be trusted. Competency alone is not enough. It comes down to a matter of trust. And the use of power in leadership is often the defining test of character. So many illustrations pop up in my mind that I'd like to share, but I'm monochronic in my culture. Eugene Peterson, in his translation of the Scriptures, The Message, has an introductory page to each of the books of the Bible. In the introduction to 2 Corinthians, there's a paragraph in the page that reads this way: because leadership is necessarily an exercise of authority, it easily shifts into an exercise of power. But the minute it does that, it begins to inflict damage on both the leader and the led. How insightful. So I guess of the things that I'd like to share with you this morning, that first one is the most important. Trust is the most important human resource in the church. The trust of members towards pastors, the trust we have as colleagues among each other, the trust we place in our members, the trust we have in organizational structure. Even though I'm very, very ready to admit to you that organization can get in our way. I've experienced that. I'm sure I have been that problem to others. And yet we need it. And it can help us. So I talk about the things that I'm still learning. Your president asked if I might share with you some things I've learned. I would like instead to say these are some things that I'm still learning. First, that trust is the most important human resource in the church. There is nothing to take its place. Competence is secondary to trust. Competence helps to shape, to nurture, to build, to establish trust. But competence alone will not create trust. That's a spiritual matter. And we have to address that privately in our relationship with God. Secondly, church governance is participatory and interdependent. Church governance, even at the local church, but church governance throughout our entire structure needs to be participatory and interdependent. I'm facing the situation that my own computer has decided to, okay, here we go. it is too easy to fall into the patterns of leadership that predominate in our society, where leadership, responsibility, and authority is largely thrust upon an individual. We have a very different pattern that is built into our church that calls for participation in developing authority and an interdependence in organizations. I was called, I wish I'd known what I was getting into, but a couple of years ago, after I was retired living up in the Northwest, I was called one day by the Office of General Counsel at the General Conference, asking if I would go to a certain conference, actually to a certain courtroom in a part of North America, and be an expert witness on a legal case that had come into being because of conflict between a local church and a conference and so forth. And things had gone on until this had become a conflict not only between the local church and the conference, the local church and its pastor, the local church and the conference. The court case that was registered was a case of the local church against the pastor, the local church against the conference, the local church against the union. The union was named as a defendant. The North American Division was a defendant. The General Conference was a defendant. The North American Division President was a defendant. And the General Conference President was a defendant. So the Office of General Counsel asked me to go and be a witness in this court session. Well, I went there, and the attorney for the General Conference, the division, and the union, and the two gentlemen, the two presidents of North America and the General Conference, was a different attorney than the attorney for the local conference. But they were working together. And so when the court case began, or before the court case began, actually, I sat down with these two attorneys, and we tried to think through some things about how to proceed. When the court case began, the judge came in and he said to the attorneys, "This is such a confusing case, I don't even know where to begin. Because you have defendants who are individuals, you have defendants who are organizations, and there's multiple organizations. So where do we begin?" The attorney said, "Well, Your Honor, if you would just allow us to put the witness on the stand, maybe in the course of interrogation, things can be sorted out." So I was called to take the stand and so forth. The attorney began by saying, "I have a chart here, and I'm going to ask you to describe for me the structure of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I'm going to start up here on this chart with the General Conference." And I said, "Sir, I'm not sure that I can help you with that. Because although I have worked at all layers of structure at the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I don't know how to describe the Seventh-day Adventist Church starting at the General Conference. I have to start at the local congregation." "Oh, okay," he said, "let's start at the local congregation." And so we went through the structure of our church and how authority is shared and authority is distributed and so forth. That attorney grilled me for an hour and 20 minutes and charted out on the paper virtually a shortened expression of everything I said. Then he said to the judge, "You see, sir, This organization is not like things we typically find. It's not like a business corporation. It is not like the military. It is not like government. It's a system with shared authority. And that authority begins at the bottom of the structure. So we went on, and finally the judge said, okay, I think I understand things. And he asked for the opposing attorney then to ask me questions. The opposing attorney really had difficulty finding some questions. He asked some very frivolous things. Like, was I a member of the local church in that place? Obviously I wasn't. Man alive, I came from 1,000 miles away. But, they've got to ask their questions and so forth. And finally, he sat down and the judge said, okay, thank you very much. That will be it for today. I will render my decision next week. Next week, his decision was to dismiss the union, the division, the general conference, the division president, and the general conference president from any involvement in this case. He said it is clear their structure is not authoritarian. It shares authority. Authority is distributed. So he released all of those units, kept the local conference and the local church in the remaining litigation, which took some time to sort out, but was finally sorted out. So I guess what I'm trying to convey here is a sense of our church polity, that we must always keep in mind that the authority of structure begins at the ground level. And it first of all flows up before it flows down. And it continually operates in both directions. We have shared authority, distributed authority in our system. The attorney came to me afterwards, after we were dismissed from the court. And he said, thank you. That was a rather lucid description of how authority functions in an organization. And I didn't tell you ahead of time that the judge comes out of the corporate world. And the judge needed to hear from you that authority in your church is not like authority in the corporate world. I wish I'd known that the judge was out of the corporate world. It might have changed a little bit of what I was trying to say. But church polity, we are neither congregational nor hierarchical. So what are we? We have elements of both of those, in a sense, some elements, but we can't classify ourselves as being totally one or the other. I don't know what is the right word for a description of denominational structure. I think until we find the right word, we are interlocking and interdependent. That means we all have some role in it. There's a certain final authority that exists at the local church that doesn't exist anywhere else in structure. It's the authority to admit members, the authority to discipline members, the authority to elect local church leadership. Nobody else can do that. And in my view of our whole denominational structure, the most important part of structure is the local church, the places where you serve. Sometimes I'm afraid we forget that in our denominational leadership roles at other layers of organization. We sometimes forget that the local church is the most important part of our church. That's where growth takes place. That's where spiritual formation takes place. That's where an understanding of authority and an understanding of organizational dynamics takes place. It doesn't happen elsewhere. So I think until we find another word, we need to think of our church governance structure as interlocking and interdependent. I keep pressing the wrong button here. We have, in a sense, in our organization, two governance systems. One I call the church or the ecclesiastical system, and the other the institutional system. There's some very important comparison and contrast issues to look at here. In the ecclesiastical system, our body of authority in day-to-day functioning is the executive committee. In the institutional system, it's the board. Now, interestingly, boards also have executive committees. And I found that this is very confusing. This is very confusing to those in our denomination who have the capacity for leadership and contribution in various roles and so forth, to understand that the executive committee of the conference is not the same as the executive committee of the hospital or the college. The executive committee of the institution is a subset of the board. The governing authority is the board. And in the ecclesiastical side of things, it's the executive committee. In the ecclesiastical system, I tell you this because I guess part of my education in leadership in the church has been in seeing both the ecclesiastical formations of structure and the special purpose formations of structure. Hospitals, publishing houses, special service agencies like General Conference Auditing Service, ADRA, and so forth. In our institutional system, we have a different way of structuring boards. In the ecclesiastical system, we have a representation-based composition. And you look at all of the constitutions and bylaws of conferences and so forth, they will tell you how do we structure the executive committee of the conference. There will be so many from the officer group, so many lay members, so many employees, and so forth. In the institutional system, there's something different. Many of our institutions structure their boards on the basis of competency, not just representation. And it creates a different dynamic in the governance. So in the institutional system, as I've experienced it, there's attention given to a skill-based composition of the leadership group, whereas in the ecclesiastical system of the church, there's more a representation-based system. Let's move on. In the church, in the church system, the membership elects the executive committee and the officers. In the institutional system, the constituency meeting of the institution elects the board, and the board elects the officers of the institution. It's quite a different, it's a different political dynamic that happens in institutional life. In the ecclesiastical system, each entity is part of a chain in the organization. In the institutional system, each entity is a stand-alone organization. Now, I have to, before somebody catches me on that, I want you to notice that stand-alone there is in quotes. It is stand-alone. It is not independent. I have used this expression, in teaching about organizational structure, that institutions are stand-alone institutions. And I often get the response, no, they're not. They're not independent. I didn't say they're independent. I said they stand alone in terms of their legal identity. They stand alone. Now, I realize there are networks and, we have hospital systems and so forth. But the institutions, compared to the church structure, the institutions tend to stand alone on their own 2 feet. In the ecclesiastical system, many employees are voting members in the decision-making body. In the institutional system, there are few employees that are voting members on the governing body. And most of our institutions, it's the head of the institution is a board member. In fact, I chaired for some 15 years an organization that had no employees on the board. The head of the institution happens to be Dick Hart, president of Loma Linda, but there was a subsidiary organization. He was not even a member of the board. By the bylaws that were set up and so forth, he was an invitee. In our denominational system, our governance structure is built with a lot of internal people. The chair of the executive committee of a denominational structure is the president of that entity. That's not true in the institutions. The chair of the institution board is not the head of the institution. The chair is external to the organization. It makes a big difference in dynamics. In the ecclesiastical structures of the church, there are many employees, usually on the executive committee. In the institutional structures of the church, very few employees on the board. You may have employees that attend a board meeting, but they're not voting members. It gives a different dynamic, particularly when it comes to the necessity of discussing sensitive issues on a board or executive committee. It makes a lot of difference. If the people are employees, how do they differ with the opinion of leadership? This can be a challenge. Listen, I don't want to strike fear or despair in anyone's heart, because I think whether one works in the ecclesiastical structure of the church or the institutional structure, I think board and committee members can be trained in how to carry out their fiduciary responsibilities very, very effectively, and not to fear differing with leadership. But there's an art to how you express things in boards and committees when you're having a different opinion from leadership. But in the institutional structures of our church, we have the chairperson is from outside the organization, and the vast majority of the board members are non-employees of the organization. That's quite different from the ecclesiastical structures. Then we have the executive committee. Well, I've talked about that both for the board and the executive committee. The chairperson is internal. In our institutional structures, the chairperson is external. it makes for a huge difference in dynamic of what goes on in meetings. In the ecclesiastical system, 3 officers are accountable to the executive committee. In the institutional system, it's primarily the CEO that is accountable to the board. In the ecclesiastical system, there's more involvement in management by the executive committee. Why is that? Because there are so many employees on the governance body. It's a built-in sense of tension there that in another class on governance and so forth, I teach the idea that the law of gravity in all boards is to go from governance towards management. It's the law of gravity. Unless the group resists that, the group will ultimately end up looking at management issues and not governance. It's just a law of gravity. It happens much easier in the ecclesiastical functions of our structure than it does in the institutional organizations, simply because of the composition of the boards. In the ecclesiastical structures, we have a lot of internal people. In the institutional structures, we have mostly external people. So there's more involvement in management, less involvement in management on the institutional side. Most of our church structures function, at least local churches function in unincorporated status. Our institutions function as incorporated organizations. That's a new dimension to functioning and the responsibilities of governance and so forth. That was one of the questions, the only question the judge had in this case I was talking to you about, where I was supposedly a witness on structure. The only question the judge had was, why are your churches not incorporated? So I spent some time to try to explain that. He seemed to accept that. Our churches find their corporate status in the conference, collectively in the conference, not in separate identities. And this was one of the issues that was at stake. A church was, well, trying to take over its property and incorporate itself, etc. It didn't work. Yeah. So let's move on. What is happening? All right. So if we look at governance performance, we think of 4 key elements, no matter where you are, a local church, local conference, college, university, publishing house, hospital. 4 key elements in governance. Number 1 is the competency of directors or trustees. Number 2 is the culture of the boardroom. Number 3 is the care of fiduciary obligations. And 4th is the conduct of essential functions. Just a comment or two about each of those. The competency of directors and trustees. We typically, in our ecclesiastical structures, we develop our governance structure based on patterns of representation. We generally, I think to our loss, give very little attention to competencies, a range of competencies on our executive committees. We're more focused on the range of representation. But we also need to think of a range of competencies. Our corporate structures, our universities, publishing houses, and our institutions tend to do a better job of looking at competencies in filling their board positions, because they don't have to be so driven by proportionate representation. But one of the tasks I think that every one of our ecclesiastical units can do is to strengthen the process of how we select the governance body for an ecclesiastical unit, for a conference, a union, and so forth. And how we get representation of expertise besides just representation of membership. The culture of the boardroom is what we mean by what kind of an atmosphere is there in the decision-making body. You know, are people free to talk? Are people really free to talk? Okay? I have heard too many. Listen, I've chaired meetings also, so maybe I am to blame for some of it. But I have heard many a time when the meeting is over, people out in the hallway will talk. And they will say, but I couldn't say that in there. Okay? There's a challenge before us, folks. A challenge before us. All of us in the boardroom, chair, secretary, and all of us are responsible for the culture of the boardroom. Any one of us can ruin the atmosphere for good decision making. Any one of us. But any one of us can also help to build that atmosphere. I think part of training, maybe I'm not sure if I come to that later in this presentation or not. I think part of training nowadays needs to be the training of groups, not just leaders. We have for, I think, a long time focused on the training of individual leaders for positions of leadership. Yet we espouse in our corporate structure as a church, we espouse the idea of group leadership and group authority. Groups always have more authority than an individual. You look at our structures. It's intended to be that way. I think it's a marvelous feature about our organizational structure. I have learned to really love the Seventh-day Adventist organizational structure, for in its theoretical presentation, pardon me, in its description, it places ultimate authority in groups, not in individuals. Okay? Now, it is a task for us as leaders to learn how to operationalize that ideal. Because we see in civil society, in government, in the military, in business, we see a different paradigm of leadership. And these cannot be our models in the church. So the culture of the boardroom is exceedingly important, where people have the freedom to speak. And where people have the wisdom to know how to speak in a group decision-making forum. Because any one person can spoil the atmosphere of good governance. Any one person can spoil the atmosphere of good governance. It's not just, it's not who is the chair. The chair has a lot of responsibility. A lot of responsibility. And I know there are other chairs who sweat in their shoes, as I do. when you sit in that position. Because how do you try to exercise leadership by facilitating rather than exercising leadership by authority? This is a challenge. And it can be learned by all of us. Listen, it can be taught. It can be learned. There are groups that can function very, very effectively. And I've been in groups that have not yet learned that. That's still on their learning list. How to function effectively as a group. The care of fiduciary obligations. We sometimes think that means looking after the finances. Fiduciary obligations refer to much more than finances. Fiduciary obligations refer to being loyal to the purposes of the organization. Okay? When a board meets, because all of our institutions are not-for-profit organizations, boards do not own the institution. They're not shareholders, but they function with the assumed authority of ownership. They act as owners, but they are not owners. We don't have shares in our colleges and universities and hospitals and so forth. But board members have to function with a fiduciary obligation that my loyalty is to the organization. It is not to myself. It is not to my own interest. If I am serving on the board of a university that serves a wide territory, I need to serve with an understanding of my fiduciary obligation to the health of the university, not to the interests of the conference or the church from which I come. You understand what we're saying about the care of fiduciary obligations? Our loyalty needs to be to the organization that we have been called to serve. And then the conduct of essential functions. I already illustrated, perhaps to you, the idea that the law of gravity in organized, and this is not only in church organizations. Listen, it happens everywhere in organizational. The law of gravity is that the agenda of a governance board will move from governance towards management unless it is deliberately resisted. I don't think I'll say more about that. It's just, if you haven't experienced that, you'll discover that. The law of gravity is there. Somehow my computer here has locked up because it's wanted to go to sleep. So in the end, I say that there are 2 commandments for board members. I have been working for a long time. I once had the audacity, I'm confessing to you some stupidity here. I once had the audacity to make 10 commandments for board members. And somebody got a hold of that one time and thought, this ought to be printed up and circulated. And I did some more thinking about that, and I realized, that's a wrong idea. I've been working on 10 commandments for a long time since. I've been working on 10 commandments for boards for probably 6 years. I have only achieved the first 2. I'm not sure I will live long enough to complete the list. But here are the first 2. Number one, make the boardroom a safe place to talk. There is nothing that is more important than that in our decision-making bodies. And number two, reserve prime time for the most important item. The boards that learn to do that will get along quite well. They will fulfill their governance structure. What often happens, and I had to, listen, I chaired the boards of Loma Linda for some 16 years. It was a marvelous opportunity given to me to learn. And I tell you, there was a lot to learn. And it was one of the board members at Loma Linda early in my experience who came to me, it was a layperson, who came to me and he said, Lowell, when you're setting up the agenda for the board, would it be possible to take the two most important items on the agenda and deal with them before lunch? Okay? Our patterns were 1.5 days of board meetings at Loma Linda. So he came to me and he said, would it be possible? You decide what is most important on that agenda, and let's do it first. I look upon that as probably one of the most important leadership lessons that I have learned, is to take the most important items while people are at their freshest in terms of energy and attention. It can be such an easy thing in leadership life to put the most important things down near the end. And you know what happens down near the end. This board member who came to me and asked to put the most important things in the morning was very, very polite. And he said, listen, I'm making this request of you because my brain drains in the afternoon. And if you want my best, I can give you my best in the morning. I'm not sure I can consistently give you my best in the afternoon. What a gracious way for him to teach me a very vital lesson about governance. Get the most important stuff up front. If you don't, what happens is you run out of time. And you end up coming to the most important items of the board or the executive committee, and people are fidgeting with their watches. They're pulling out their plane tickets. What was the departure time for that? When do I, the mind is already, the mind has left the boardroom, but the bodies are still there. So this person taught me an incredibly important lesson. Reserve prime time for the most important item or items. We started adopting that pattern in the Loma Linda boards. That our first time of engagement, we were hitting the heavy stuff. We always made sure that we spent the amount of time we needed on the heavy items. The others could fall into place. I can only think of one time when we didn't complete our agenda in the scheduled time. So, if I were thinking of 10 commandments for group leadership, these are the two. I don't know the others. You will have to maybe complete the list. I'm probably too old to work on it. We'll never get it done. So there are some things that I'm still learning. Trust is the most important human resource. Church governance needs to be participatory and interdependent. Thirdly, mission rationale must drive infrastructure development and resource sharing. We have had, going on for some time now, conversations in our church, even maybe primarily at the general conference level, all about structure. How many unions do we need? How many divisions do we need? How many conferences do we need? And so forth. These discussions will never end. I'm not sure that we will ever get the optimum solution. I think these are things we will have to continue to work on. But during the time that I worked at the General Conference, I worked in 3 different commissions to deal with how much structure do we need at the General Conference. 3 different commissions. One was very small. The other 2 were more elaborate in terms of the scope and studies and so forth that we came with. What are the results of these commissions? The first primary result or discovery out of the commission study is that not every area of the church needs the same level of service from the General Conference. So we don't need to have 13 departments, or whatever there is, with departmental personnel traveling equally to all 13 divisions. It's just not necessary, because there are some divisions that have expertise equal to that of the General Conference. We tried in one of these commissions to look at structure, departmental structure. And it came down, and in the surveys and studies we did, it came down to an even split. There were several divisions, that we might, I don't like to use the term strong divisions, but several well-developed, the talent pool of leadership within these divisions was very highly developed. And there were others that had less developed talent pool for leadership. And these studies came out. Every one of them ended up with kind of a split. Some divisions saying, yes, we desperately need all these departments. Other divisions saying, well, we don't need this service or that service or another service because we have sufficient people. In fact, we can make contributions to the General Conference departments and so forth. So in these studies, what has happened is that we still have not changed structure very much. And yet, no matter where you go, people will say, we ought to change structure. We ought to change structure. I don't know who's going to do the next studies. I was involved in 3 of them. And they were rather intensive, but they didn't result in significant organizational restructuring around a missional rationale. And when I say a missional rationale, we're looking at both the resources applied to structure and the purpose of structure. As I've traveled around the world, and for several years, even before I retired, but also since retirement, I've traveled around the world conducting some leadership seminars. And I've made it kind of a personal study to look at what is the mission statement of the organization. I find that most organizations copy the mission statement of the General Conference. They have not localized the mission statement. I appreciate what your conference has on the logos here about what its mission is. I think that's a very succinct statement. Surely the conference participates in this large global mission statement of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, to carry the 3 angels' messages to all the world, and so forth and so forth. But we need to have a missional rationale that drives every level of structure. Every level of structure. I've traveled, I have visited all of the divisions. And whenever I go to an organization, to a division or unit, I usually don't go to a local entity. Thank you for the invitation. This is just really precious to me. Thank you for that. I usually don't travel to a local conference. But I've always asked, can you show me the mission statement for your organization? Usually, it's the denominational mission statement that's in the General Conference Working Policy Book. And I ask the question, what is your operational mission statement? We don't know what you mean. We don't know what you mean. So I think part of our challenge structurally is to look at why this level of organization exists. Everything beyond local church level, everything beyond local church level has a purpose that is subservient to what we expect from the local church. We have had difficulty in knowing how to capture that. As I know, we need organizations that operate institutions. We need organizations that help to facilitate our worldwide familyness and so forth. We need all of that. But do we need the structures that we have? Listen, I'm in the North American division. I cannot count on one hand the times that I've heard leadership in North America say, we don't sense we need all the structure that we have, but we don't know how to revise the structure. So I think the challenge for the church is to put a mission rationale that drives our infrastructure development and our resource sharing. I was at a meeting. I hope no one is here, but it may be because people get around. I was at a meeting when I heard a pastor lament that at his local church there were no resources to do things for mission. I mean, they were struggling to keep the doors open and the windows washed and the light bulbs in place, But he said, I look elsewhere in the structure, and I see groups of leaders traveling internationally. I see, I see that there's a lot of money in the church, but there isn't money at my place. So I don't know how to solve that problem, but I think it is part of our structural issues that we need to look at to develop a missional rationale for everything we have in structure. And realize that it's the local church that is the center of spiritual fellowship, development, and growth. And somehow, there will be short shelf life for any leader who plays around with organizational structure. But we have to be asking ourselves these questions and make sure that we are aligning resources at the place where mission happens. I don't have an easy solution for you, obviously. Well, let's move on here. Church history underscores Where are we? Okay. Church history underscores the importance of organizational structure in connection with mission, action, and results. The church has always had to wrestle with its self-perception as an institution or a movement. Institutions tend to define, protect, and preserve their role. Movements are always dynamic and run the risk of dissipation and loss of focus. What is the church? An institution or a movement? Yes, yeah. Isn't that the task of leadership? And we all face it, no matter where you might find your position of responsibility in denominational structure. This will be a challenge to you. To whom was the gospel commission given? To individuals, to groups, or to organizations? It's a good question. What's the role of organizational structure, any organizational structure, in respect to Christian mission throughout the world? I'd like to suggest that here are some principles for organizational structure. It's more to coordinate than to control, more to collaborate than to compete, more to optimize means than to create machinery, and more to communicate priorities than to restrain initiative. Now, with these as guiding principles, I think it's a task, it's a responsibility of leadership to look at organizational structure, to make sure that these are the priorities. So, things I'm still learning. There's need for more leadership and less management. The trend in organizations today, I'm not speaking only of religious organizations, the trend is toward more networking and less hierarchy. Do you find that to be the case? Everywhere I go, I see elements of that. Less need for organizational management and more need for organizational leadership. For years, while I worked at the General Conference, I somehow, maybe because others found a way of escape, I ended up being on the Policy Development and Review Committee. This is a special grace that is given to people who need to learn discipline in their lives or something. So I spent considerable time on that committee. I tell you, it is increasingly difficult to write world policy. It's increasingly difficult to write world policy. I have only 2 minutes, so what can I say? We need to be writing policy more in terms of concept than in terms of rule. There's a saying, Mark Rubio, the politician, he's the one who invented this or quoted this. Policy doesn't matter until it matters, and then it matters a lot. So I guess, my message to leaders is, let's pay attention to our policies, but let's also remember we need to have engagement in the creation of policies. From the church manual to the policy manual of that governs the rest of our organization. Number 6, I guess here's the point that I see as the culmination of anything I could share with you about structure and leadership issues, is that mission happens at the local level. It's at the local church. It's at the local school. And whatever we do else in terms of organizational structure has to keep in mind that that's where life happens. That's where spiritual life takes place. That's where spiritual growth takes place. That's where numerical growth takes place. It happens at the local level. So I conclude today by thanking you who give leadership at the local level. That's where it's at. Thank you very much.